I have the great pleasure of hosting Professor Jeremi Suri. So, Professor Suri, thank you so much for your time and for doing this podcast.
My pleasure. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you.
Wonderful. So, let's start with a question on how did you start your journey in history and what got you in studying history?
I was always interested in history from a very young age, in part because I'm the child of immigrants. My father is an immigrant from India who came to the United States in 1965. That's where the name Suri comes from. And my mother is actually the child of immigrants, Jewish immigrants who left Russia for their safety. So both sides of my family came to the United States, and I grew up in New York City, and I was very conscious of this history. I didn't understand that one could study history, but from the time I can remember, I always was interested in reading history, learning about history, trying to understand what was it that led my family to come to this country from two very different directions. I went to a school in New York City, Stuyvesant High School, a very good public school that emphasized math and science. So that was really what I focused on when I was younger. But then when I went to college, when I went to Stanford, I was fortunate to have some college history courses that I took. And I realized this is something I had always loved. I didn't understand what it would look like as a discipline. And so, from a very early time in my college career, I decided this is something I wanted to study because I was so passionate about it.
I see. And you also write and speak a lot about leadership. So, what do you think defines effective leadership in such turbulent times like nowadays?
This is a very good question. Let me say what leadership is not, some of the myths of leadership. Leadership is not being the strongest person. Leadership is not being the smartest person, even. Too many people think that you have to push your way on people to be a leader. It's just the opposite. Machiavelli, I think, gets this best, right? To be an effective leader, you have to get people to do what they would not do otherwise. And you get them to do that by a mix of incentives and punishments, right? As Machiavelli says, a mix of love and fear. And leaders in any context see the capabilities, the talent, the resources around them, and they figure out for the circumstances they're in how to best get those resources to work towards some common goals, whether it's national security or the growth of your economy or the growth of your business. So there isn't one kind of leader or one kind of personality. There is the adjustment to circumstance and fitting your personality to that circumstance. And that's why leaders who are very successful in one environment might not be successful in another environment. When you're choosing leaders, as either as voters or on a search company or whatever, you are choosing the person who you think is the right kind of leader for the right kind of circumstance.
I see. And from a historical perspective, which global leaders do you believe have had the most significant positive impact and why?
So I think one of the most globally influential leaders of the 20th century and 21st century is Franklin Roosevelt, who I've written quite a bit about. He had many flaws, right? Great leaders are not perfect leaders, but Franklin Roosevelt had two insights that were very important, right? First, he understood that the United States had to play a role in the world, but not as a new empire, but as a country that would build institutions and build cooperation, right? So it was not the United States as a new tyrant, but the United States using its power to encourage others to make choices for themselves that would benefit the US. So this is why he believed in creating institutions that later become the United Nations, NATO, even though that's not something he had thought about. I think the idea of an alliance like that would have matched his way of thinking. And the second element, I think, in addition to that, that made him a great leader, was he also recognized that you had to make people's lives better for them to buy into this. And this is the New Deal element of him using government not to take over people's lives, but to create the conditions under which more people would prosper. Prosper through access to resources, prosper through educational institutions. One of the most important things he does in 1944 is pass legislation that provides a college education and the ability to buy a house for every American who served in the military. So these kinds of programs, what we'd call the New Deal and international liberalism, I think these were two things that still shape the way our world operates.
Mhm. And what would you say? What role does history play in shaping the leaders of today? So, can they truly learn from the past examples or experiences?
I hope so because that's why I write my books and do my podcast and everything. This is sort of the business I'm in, right? Is saying that history can teach you something. I think history is absolutely essential. And what I have found is that most leaders, the higher they go, the more they look to history. Early in your career, you look to the technical knowledge. As you move higher, you need more historical knowledge. What does history provide you? It doesn't provide you a recipe, but it provides you a broader understanding of the challenges you face. What you see in the headlines is only one manifestation of what the problem is. Any problem you face is like an iceberg. More of it is underground, more of it is in the past than in the present. And you cannot address that issue unless you understand that history. Let's take a very obvious example. Wherever you stand, on the war in Ukraine, you cannot begin to think about having some kind of way to move forward, some strategy, without understanding the history of Ukraine and the history of Russia and the history of the Cold War. And so, historical knowledge gives us the foundation to understand the problem. You can't solve the problem till you understand the problem.
Hmm. Right. And how do different cultures influence leadership styles and effectiveness across the globe?
So, culture is a crucial influence on leadership style. First of all, culture influences how leaders come of age. Our culture is where we're educated. We're educated in the set of ideas around us, the set of assumptions around us. And then our cultural assumptions will often shape the way we think about what power is and how we use power. So, what we've seen is that often those who come from non Western backgrounds can see and make use of power in ways that are not seen by those who are from perhaps more Western backgrounds. Women might have the ability to cooperate in ways that men don't because men have not been acculturated to cooperate in certain ways. I wrote a book about Henry Kissinger. One of Kissinger's big advantages in the United States was he had a deeper European sense of how institutions and power had developed. So I think culture is, in a sense, it's kind of the seed through which the development of leadership grows.
I see. And you have written many, many great books. And one of them was a book on Henry Kissinger. So, how powerful was he during his time, actually?
He was very I mean, the thing that's extraordinary about Henry Kissinger is he was never elected to any office. He comes to the United States, where my book begins, as an immigrant, as a refugee. At age 15, he doesn't even speak English. His family comes to the United States because they're fleeing Nazi crimes. They're fleeing anti-Semitism, and he has no idea that he will ever go into policy. But what changes his life is, of course, the experience of being a refugee, and then World War II, where he goes into the U.S. Army. And what he realizes is he has an enormous power in understanding these places the United States and its allies are fighting. And being Jewish, which is his problem, also becomes an attribute, a positive attribute for him, because even though many Americans don't trust him because he's an immigrant, they recognize because he's Jewish, he cannot be pro Nazi. And so this gives him leverage within the military and elsewhere. And then what Kissinger does is he builds on the network and the knowledge that he gains early. As American society is adjusting to a more dominant international role, he becomes one of the first figures who's there from the beginning, has the knowledge, knows the people, builds the network. And so he becomes essential for elected figures like Richard Nixon, who need someone who knows who to talk to and knows how to talk to them. And so he's in the right place at the right time. But what to me is so interesting is he's self conscious about this and he uses it to boost himself. And by the 1970s, he is the second most powerful person in the United States making policy. And quite often, when Richard Nixon is preoccupied or focused on other issues or then forced to resign, Henry Kissinger is really the person making policy, and it's quite extraordinary.
I see. And you have also written about many, many American presidents. So, what qualities do you think that have been the most crucial for effective presidential leadership in US history?
Wow, it's a great question. This is what my book, The Impossible Presidency, is about. I think there are 3 things that have generally been what have made presidents successful. First of all, they have to play the long game. You cannot solve every problem. With every generation, presidents are expected to solve every problem. Now people want them to bring down the price of food and to do everything. You have to choose a few issues. You have to be very strategic. That's the first thing. Second, you have to be able to work with different kinds of people, especially those who are your adversaries. You have to be able to negotiate with your adversaries. So, a successful American president has to be able to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, with Xi Jinping. You have to be able to work with your adversaries. No matter how powerful the United States is, you cannot make the world conform to you. And then the third thing I think that's absolutely crucial as a president is you need to bring around you people who are very capable, who understand your agenda, but can put it into action because you cannot, as president, you have too much. One of the points I make in the book is there's too much to do, so you have to delegate. And the most successful presidents, like a Ronald Reagan, had figures like George Shultz as Secretary of State, who could do so much of the work for them.
And which American president do you think is most misunderstood, and what do you think people should know about them?
So, one president I wrote about recently is Ulysses Grant. This goes back to the 19th century. Grant was, of course, the commander, the general for Union forces. So, he's the general who wins the Civil War. He then becomes president in 1868 and remains president until 1876. And he was often seen until about 10, 15 years ago. He was remembered as a very ineffective president because there was a lot of corruption around him. He didn't drink too much as a president, but he had a drinking problem before that, so that was carried over. And because he was a general, he wasn't the best politician. He wasn't very good at persuading people and things like that. What we've learned, me and other historians who have looked at his letters and read carefully, is in fact he was a president who really tried to bring the country together and understood the issues of race and civil rights. Because as general, he had seen African Americans in the army, Jews, Catholics, and others who were discriminated against, and he had seen what good soldiers they were. And this is a common theme in American history. Groups that are discriminated against, they prove themselves in war, and then they get a place in American society. This was certainly helpful for Jews during World War II. And so Grant sees this, and as president, he is trying to use the government to create a more equal civil society. So, for example, it is Ulysses Grant who creates the Justice Department. There was an attorney general, but there was not a Justice Department before. The Justice Department was supposed to hold people accountable for violence, even if their state government wouldn't. So, Grant is taking a lot of what we would see now as very modern, effective measures to bring the country together. He was not as effective in the end because there was an economic depression in 1873, and he had to basically pull all the funding from these programs. But in retrospect, he looks like a very far-sighted person, and there's an important lesson in that, right? We need presidents who have experience with the people, who can see beyond the ideology. I think one of the things that history shows is ideology is unavoidable, but ideology distorts your understanding of reality. Reality is always more complex than being liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, and real policy is made in between.
Right. And what do you see as the most significant turning points in American democracy over the past century?
Over the past century. So I think certainly the Great Depression and World War II, which is when the United States really develops for the first time a welfare state, and when the United States develops an international presence, more than business, but now military, political. We become a world power and we become a modern state. And that makes our democracy better in the sense that more people are connected to our democracy, but it also makes our democracy worse in that the expectations go so high that it's very hard for people to be satisfied. Democracy becomes not just a form of government, but it now becomes almost a religious faith for people. So there's that element that's a key turning point. Another turning point, I think, is the late 1950s. So about 15 years after the war, when two things happen at the same time: international and domestic. The United States no longer has the dominant position of being free from foreign attack as the Soviet Union now develops nuclear capabilities that can reach the United States. And you have the beginnings of a civil rights movement as a generation of African Americans and others who have come back from war and have become more wealthy now demand more rights. And the United States goes through a major transformation, a transformation that creates a lot of disruption, but then builds a society that I think, at least for a while, is much more effective as an international society and much more effective at home. We become a more complex society. It's the beginnings of many of the changes that we take for granted now in higher education and technology and many, many other areas.
Right. And what would you say are the greatest challenges facing democracy in the 21st century?
Oh, there are many. There are many. I think two that I would single out are that, first of all, we have in the United States in particular, we have a lot of legacy institutions. Is what I write about in my recent book. We have institutions that have worked well for democracy, but now the society has changed and the institutions have not adjusted. And it's hard to adjust the institutions because people don't agree on what to do in place of them. The Electoral College is an example of this. It's an 18th century institution that doesn't make sense. Gerrymandering and the way that we set up our districts. There are all kinds of things we do that worked for a while but don't work today because our society is so much bigger, so much more complex. And it's hard to change those institutions. So, one problem with democracy is democracies actually are very conservative, lowercase c. They get very attached to existing institutions. It's easier for a dictator to say, okay, this institution is outdated, we're going to change it tomorrow. So, that's one challenge. And I think it's true for the mature democracies, in particular in Europe, in North America and elsewhere. And then a second challenge we have is that the world is dominated by strong nation states. We think of democracy still as nation states. We don't really think of the European Union as one democracy. We think of it as many democracies. But the world is more global in the ways in which supply chains operate, in the ways in which capital moves, in the ways in which people are moving. And so there's a mismatch, and that's part of the source of a lot of populism today. Populists of all kinds, they're on the left and the right. Populists are people who are saying, okay, we want to stop these global effects, these global things from affecting your life. We can't do that. We can't do that. The United States will never again make all the products it wants. We could, but that's not the way the world works. And our population, whether we're talking about US, Europe, anywhere, is more diverse than ever before. And that's not going to change. But our institutions are still, in a sense, very nation centered, even though these changes are global. And people who don't feel they can compete look to the institutions to insulate them from change, which creates a lot of violence, which creates a lot of disruption. I think that's what's happening in the United States and in other countries right now.
And now, when you mentioned institutions, how can institutions adapt to growing influence of misinformations and technology?
Yeah, this is a really hard question. Almost every day, someone asks me this question. I mean, the first thing we have to do is we have to educate people better. People need to do what your listeners to your podcast are doing. They need to listen and then think about, okay, who is telling me this? Why are they telling me this? We have to think critically, not just believe what reinforces our prejudices or believe only what is on one channel or one set of Twitter feeds. What I tell my students is you have to read broadly, even things you don't agree with, and you have to critically evaluate your sources. Why are people saying things? What is credible? There are facts, but don't assume that someone is giving you the facts, right? So we have to be better consumers. We do this for food, right? We do this for things that we're buying, right? You don't just buy a house without doing your research on it. We need to do this for issues of politics and policy when we're reading about that. Then I think we as societies need to invest more. I believe in a complete free press. I don't think there should be any limits on the free press, but we need to create government funded but not government controlled sources of media that don't have an incentive to simply get more clicks. So it should be in the way we do education. Funding should be given. The government should not be able to say what you say. You can actually they should the government should be funding opposition press, opposition to the government, but it should be funded, and that funding should not be contingent on trying to get more clicks. Just being the most popular news site doesn't make you the best news site. This is why I still like BBC, for example. It's fun when there was a coup attempt in South Korea, right? I looked not to my Twitter or whatever. I looked to BBC, to figure out what was going on, right? Because they at least have an incentive to tell me the news, not an incentive just to get me to click on things and that sort. So I'm for private media. They should exist. There should be a diverse space, but we should be invested in media that has an incentive more to the facts. And then the last thing we should do, we need more transparency. We need our government agencies to tell us about what Russia is doing to interfere with our media. We need to be more, they need to reveal more of that. And we need to be educated about that. I've told my students, I hope I don't offend any of your listeners, but you cannot cite RT in my class as a source, right? Or if you cite it, you have to cite it as Putin's mouthpiece, not as there are news sources in Russia. We know that, right? But this is not one of them, right? And everyone should know that.
What role do you think charisma and personal character play in effective crisis leadership?
Well, charisma is absolutely important, right? The concept comes from Max Weber in the late 19th century, and he was thinking about religious prophets and others. What charisma does, and I think Machiavelli and others anticipate this, it's a personality that helps others to connect and believe and see a truth they wouldn't see otherwise. And this is important, right? Because sometimes leaders have to tell people difficult things. And if you have charisma, if they believe in you as a leader, it's easier for people to accept difficult things. But charisma, as Weber writes, is dangerous because it can be misused. And so I think you cannot over rely on charisma. You need charisma and you need good institutions and you need a good policy. It is not a substitute. It is not
So
a
basically,
substitute.
so basically, it's a whole package.
Exactly. Exactly. But you need it. It's very hard to inspire people without charisma.
Mhm. And what would you say? How has diplomacy evolved in the modern era compared to previous centuries?
It's very different. It's a great question. So diplomats 300, 400 years ago, they were basically court figures. They were people who would sit around the court of the monarch, and they would play games, eat meals, and listen, and then make negotiations. In that sense, it was a familial monarchical game, which is why the early Americans of the 18th century did not like diplomacy because they thought it was about aristocracy. Then in the 19th century, you began to have rules. This is one of the contributions of Prince Metternich and Otto von Bismarck. They created rules, and the rules around diplomacy were not just that you don't kill diplomats, that was an old rule, but the new rules were you had people who were more professional, who would write telegrams a certain way and interact. And there was a certain way in which negotiations occurred. And that's why you begin to see these large conferences, what we would call summits, Congress of Vienna, things of that sort, where you have professionals who are trained with languages and various other things. Then in the 20th century, particularly in the early 20th century, from let's say World War I through the Cold War, diplomacy is now not just about professionalism, it's also about states using diplomats to provide another source of power on the ground. Diplomats are doing what we call public diplomacy. In the United States, we invest a lot of money in building libraries in Europe after World War II. We want there to be libraries so people can read. And then we have diplomats who are working on the radio, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where we're using diplomacy not simply to learn about societies and negotiate, but to reach the people, public diplomacy. What's happened in the 21st century is that a lot of this work that was done by diplomats, it's still being done, but a lot of it has been centralized through technology. So it was formerly the case until even the 1970s or 80s, you had to let the diplomat do their job and report back to you. And if you read in the archives, as I do, much of what diplomats do is they write daily reports. This is who I talked to. This is what I said. Today it's on Zoom, right? And someone can be listening in from Washington even when you're in Berlin and talking to someone, right? And so a lot of it, more of it is centrally controlled. And what diplomats are often doing now is translating on the side, adjusting on the side to the conversations between the capitals, between the leaders. So the diplomats are less driving the action, they're much more working on the margins, which is very important. So, an example of this is recently Secretary of State Tony Blinken was in the Middle East quite often trying to negotiate between the Saudis and the Israelis and the Jordanians and other shuttle diplomacy, we call it. When Kissinger did this in the 70s, Kissinger negotiated and only told the president after the negotiations what was going on. Now, when Blinken is there, the White House is following everything he does. He still has an important role. Personal relationships matter. But much of what he's doing is not leading the negotiation. He's getting orders from Washington. And, Netanyahu is giving orders to his diplomat, the Saudis to theirs. And then they're trying to adjust those orders. So it's much more driven from the center. And it's much more now about adjusting to what the center wants, what your leaders want in that particular space, rather than it coming from that space out. And that's, I think, a challenge for today because I think diplomats did better when they had more freedom. They have less freedom now to make decisions.
I see. And how can countries balance national interest with the necessity for global cooperation in today's interconnected world?
Yeah, I mean, countries will always defend their national interest. That's what countries do. That's the sociology of nation states, and that's true. That's something we can go back to the 15th century and see, right? Um, but what leaders need to recognize today, and publics need to understand, is that your national interest is often tied to cooperation. So you're not cooperating for the sake of cooperating, but your national interest is tied to cooperation more than ever before. The most obvious example of this is environmental issues. No matter what you do, you cannot breathe your own air. You're breathing someone else's air, right? And most countries are reliant upon resources, basic water resources, and other things from other countries. So your own national interest is served by cooperation, which means that sometimes in the short term, you have to get less than what you fully want in order for, in the long term, to have access to more. And I think one of the historical lessons I've written about, that other historians have written about, that Americans lose sight of, is when you are the most powerful, wealthiest country, you actually should not demand more. You should give more because the system benefits you. So we should make, in an ideal world, we would historically make more gestures to give things to others and not take as much power because we want to protect the system which supports us as a whole. It's sort of like when you invest, you're not worried about the returns today and tomorrow. You want to have long-term investments. And our long-term investments are a system that provides for freer exchange of ideas, freer exchange of goods. All these things will benefit the US probably more than anyone else in the long run.
Mhm. And the US has played a major role on the world stage for decades. So, how would you assess the American foreign policy nowadays?
Well, I think American foreign policy today, as always, is very much built around trying to, in various parts of the world, maintain stability, protect our interests, but also limit harm where we can, right? Again, we have an interest in stability. The challenge we face today is not that we do a lot of things badly. It's that we don't do a lot of things well. It's mediocrity. We're involved in too many places. Think about Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, North Korea, uh, everywhere the United States is involved. And what happens is we spend more than $800 billion on our military budget, more than I think all the European countries together, probably more than most of the world, excluding China. But yet we don't have enough because we're everywhere. Right? This is we are the rich person who's also poor because you're spending your money in too many places. Now, it's very hard to say we're not interested in something, but we have to do a better job of focusing on key things. And that's very hard to do in a democracy because every group has its people who want something. And it's very hard to do when you're a big power because what happens everywhere does affect us. But we do have to make choices, and we have to be better at working with partners to take some of the burden off of us, right? So if you think about East Asia, right now, the United States is defending Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. This is all stuff we should do, but we're doing that in addition with the rise of China, in addition to all of the other things. So our challenge is what my former advisor, Paul Kennedy, another great historian, wrote, this is overstretch. We're in too many places.
And how has the role of United States as a global leader changed since the Cold War? And where do you see it heading in the future?
Yeah. So I think coming out of the Cold War, this is the new book I'm working on, actually, what you asked me, but coming out of the Cold War, the United States feels like it has been victorious. It's vindicated in everything it's been doing. And this is a problem because we assume that a lot of the things we believed in will naturally happen, that everyone agrees with us. And so there's this period after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 10, 15 years of euphoria, utopia. And we think things are going in our direction. And then when they don't, especially when we see the terrorist attack of 9/11, September 11th, 2001, there's big disillusionment. Oh my gosh, how could this happen? And then a turn to more, I think, overly militarized ways of approaching the world. And I think we haven't reconciled ourselves to the fact that a post Cold War world is a world where the United States is very powerful, but countries have different interests from before. And they don't necessarily see the United States as always being their savior from communism, because communism is not the same kind of threat. So we have had trouble figuring out what it is that we really want to prioritize. And we've had trouble managing our alliances and managing our power to serve our interest. We put too much into the Middle East with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and not enough into our relationships elsewhere. And then we try to compensate for that. So we're sort of a foreign policy without a clear identity. We had a very clear identity in the Cold War. We haven't figured out what our identity is now, and that's, I think, the criticism that Trump has made in different words. But he's basically saying, look, we've done all these things in the world, and they haven't served our interests, right? So that's the question now.
And which historical US foreign policy decision would you say had the most unintended consequences?
Yeah, so I think there's no doubt that the United States' decision to go to war in Vietnam, uh, which when the United States became involved in Vietnam in the 1950s, and then when we went to war, military force in 1964, most Americans didn't even know where Vietnam was. They couldn't identify it. They couldn't tell you what our interests were. The only thing they knew is that there were communists nearby, and somehow we thought we were stopping communists. That war, first of all, tore American society apart, because in that war you had a draft for the first few years. So you had lots of Americans, eventually 50,000, who died in a war they didn't want to go to. The war changed the American economy because we spent so much money on it. The war changed the image of the United States in the world. And the war made it very hard for the United States to make the investments and relationships elsewhere. So it had big effects at home and abroad. It was not fatal, but it was not only a failed war, but it was a war that had enormous social and political implications. And many of our divisions in the U.S. today come from that era in some respects. So I would say that, in retrospect, if we could reverse that decision, that would be a lot better for the United States.
Right. And how do you think social media and digital platforms have changed the way we understand history and political discourse?
So there's good and bad, and I always like to remind people of that. You can always focus on the bad. Let me start with the good. We're seeing one example of it here. I think podcasts are fantastic. That's why I always agree to do them. I have my own podcast, obviously. Podcasts allow you to have a conversation like we're having now. Uh, you couldn't do this even in the 1950s and 60s in the media. You could not go on CBS News for an hour or half an hour and have an in-depth conversation where you ask difficult questions and I try to answer them in a friendly way. And I'm always amazed at how many of my students listen to podcasts. When I grew up, we would go work out or go in the car on a bicycle, and you would listen to music. But my students, they listen to podcasts, and they listen to all different kinds, right? They listen to you, they listen to me, they listen to Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman. They're listening to all of this. I mean, it's very funny. Every time I walk through the airport, someone comes up to me and says, "I saw you on Lex Friedman." And it's amazing. People are watching. People are watching all this stuff, right? So that's good. these are real conversations. And most podcasts have people with different points of view also. So this has given ordinary people access to opinion leaders, to thoughtful conversation. They're sitting in on a seminar without having to go to the university, right? This is wonderful. And I think my students are better for it. The other thing that's great about social media is if you are interested, you can get good information from anywhere in the world. I used to, when I was a graduate student at Yale, I would go into the library and I wanted to read the newspapers in Germany and in Russia. And I'd have to read the newspaper from a week ago or 5 days ago. Now I can go and read it, and I love doing this. I can read Die Zeit, I can read all these things, Le Monde in real time, and even like when there was this attempted coup in South Korea, I don't read Korean, but I could go to those sites and use Google Translate and actually read. I mean, this is a golden age for information availability, and if you are smart and you're using it right, critically, you have access to so much. You have more information than a king had a century ago. So this is amazing. These are the good things. The bad things are that social media does put a premium on being outrageous and saying something that grabs people's attention. There's a pornography to it, a pornography of violence, and human beings are drawn to that, right? Unfortunately, even very well educated people, and I think that distorts us. It's like when I grew up, we would have billboards on the side on the highway. Now the billboard is in your bedroom, and it's like Times Square is in your bedroom, and you're seeing all this stuff, and you have to be really disciplined, and most people aren't, and it affects you even when you're very disciplined because you keep seeing this. And in this sense, Joseph Goebbels was right. If you tell the lie enough, right, people see it. And so this is a real problem. This is and it's a real problem even with very educated people. And then there's also the problem, which is not surprising, the problem of oligopoly, which is that these platforms, there are actually not that many. They are owned by very few people, and then those who own them use them to their own interest. This is not a new phenomenon. In the early 20th century, we had this problem with newspapers in the US, William Randolph Hearst and others. For a while, we had this with television, right? And so now we have the problem of Elon Musk and others who own these platforms, Mark Zuckerberg, and have inordinate influence. We have to develop regulatory mechanisms. They should have the right to own and make money, but they should not have a monopoly or an oligopoly, and they should not be able to distort information. I have seen myself on my own Twitter feed how they change the algorithm, and all of a sudden, it's amazing. Even though I keep telling them I don't want to read Elon Musk's posts, I still always get Elon Musk's. I can't unless I leave Twitter. Right, this is a problem. Right? This is like a Big Brother problem from Orwell. So, but we can fix that. We can fix that with regulation. We can still have private enterprise, but we can develop state mechanisms for regulating that.
Mhm. And what are your thoughts on historical context behind the current rise of nationalism around the world?
I think it comes back to what we were talking about before. I think people feel that in their communities they have lost control of their lives. So this is, I think, would be true if we were talking about a village in the former Yugoslavia, or we're talking about a small town in East Texas, right? People who have grown up, they're actually now is in this time compared to 30 or 40 years ago, they're living better. Actually, they have a bigger house, they have more air conditioning, they have streaming services, so they can watch movies whenever they want. They have all these things, but they feel they don't control their community anymore because everything that they're getting is owned by someone somewhere else. And they don't have control. It used to be that they knew the person who owned the hardware store. Now it's Walmart. It used to be they would go to the movie theater and they knew the owner. Now it's Netflix, right? So they feel they don't have control. They feel disempowered, and they're angry about that. That makes them insecure, and so they want control over their lives. And what authoritarians promise, right? This is always the attraction of the authoritarian. They say, "I will fix it for you if you look like me, or you're on my side. I will protect you. The market won't protect you." The market is Mark Zuckerberg and Netflix, right? But I will protect you, right? And so it's tribal and it's natural and it's not new to this moment. We go through these different historical phases when you have major shifts of this kind, and that's what's going on now. And the irony of it is that reaction, that authoritarian reaction, makes it harder to help people because what you actually need are investments by society in new schools, new infrastructure, new ways of training people to have more access to control over their lives, but they rebel against it because they don't trust it. And that's I think from Viktor Orban to Bolsonaro to Trump, that's what we're seeing.
Mhm. And are there any lessons we can take from the collapse of past empires that might be relevant to understanding today's global power shifts?
Yes, yes, and some of them are old lessons we have to learn again, right? They're not unique to me as a historian. Historians before me, I think, had uncovered these lessons, right? One, you cannot survive as an island, right? You have to stay connected. You can manage your connections, but even a country as big and as wealthy as the United States, you cannot be isolationist. This is a myth. This is a myth, right? And it's even less true now.
Sorry, would you say that China is an island today?
They're trying. They have this was their problem, of course, in the 18th and 19th centuries. China in the 16th century, 400 years ago, was the wealthiest and most sophisticated country. And they tried to be an island. And this is so when you isolate yourself, you decline. When you isolate, you decline. So that's one important lesson. Another important lesson is you must always innovate, and innovation requires diversity. You must have different kinds of people. This has been the American secret, right? When people ask me when I travel around the world, what is the American secret? It's not the Constitution. It's actually that throughout our history, talented people have come to the United States with the incentive to actually create new things. And that's the story, right? Sometimes they came because they were refugees. Sometimes they came because they didn't even want to come. They were slaves. Sometimes they came because they wanted to. It doesn't matter, right? Talent came here and talent created things. And talent is usually not the mainstream group. The group that's in power now will be less talented because they have more incentive to be lazy when they're in power. It's always the group that is trying to rise into power, right? We see this as educators, by the way. My best students are almost always the students who are what I used to be, first generation. They've arrived, their parents have no money, but their parents have done everything to say, "You go to school and you get better, and then you go and run a business," and so you need that. You need that diversity. You need different kinds of people. Immigration is good. Immigration makes you better as a society. And then the third thing I'd say is that you cannot spend all your money on war and defense. You must invest in soft power, as we were talking about it before. Those are the investments that in the long run. Military investments in the short run keep you safe, but the other investments in the long run. That's why we have Silicon Valley. That's why we have what we do in here because we made these other investments.
What are the qualities that the next generation of leaders will need in a world that is kind of increasingly unpredictable?
So you just you it's a great question and you asked the question for what I do for a lot of my courses is trying to teach people these things. The first is the obvious thing. You need to be able to adjust. You cannot be rigid. You cannot be rigid in what you know and in what you think. You have to be constantly learning. What has happened, I think, with every era of history is human beings need, with every era, to deal with more complexity. And the only way you deal with more complexity, whether you're going from Ptolemy to Copernicus, Franklin to Roosevelt, it doesn't, you must be able to keep learning and educate yourself, right? And so that requires a flexibility of mind. And to say what I believed 5 years ago does not have to be what I believe today. And I need to surround myself with people who will teach me, right? If you think you are a know it all, you will fail as a leader. But if you think you're a good learner and you don't have the answer, but you can ask good questions and find people to help you answer those questions, then you will be a very successful leader. So that's the first thing. Second, you have to be able to work with more different kinds of people. The days are gone when it can be a group of, white men sitting in a boardroom. No, you're going to be working with all different kinds of people, different languages, different cultures. You have to be comfortable with that. You have to learn to be comfortable with that. You have to learn to adjust to that. And then I think you have to learn how to take selective risks. Not risk on everything, but not so conservative that you're afraid to take risks. So you have to make strategic, and that's where history helps because history helps you say, okay, I think this is a good risk because I think this is changing. I see a longer trend in change here, and so I believe I can take a risk on that. And then it also has to be said, you have to have integrity, you have to have ethics. Otherwise, people will throw you out eventually. You can, in the short run, win, but not for the long run.
Mhm. And my final question: so, what gives you hope about the future of democracy and leadership, and given all the challenges we see today?
So, what gives me hope is my job every day working with young people, because what I see is that there are a lot of problems young people have. We haven't talked about this, but COVID is still a trauma for people. There are all sorts of issues, drug addiction, all sorts of things. But yet, what we have in many societies, particularly the US, is we have a generation of young people who are incredibly talented, who want to learn, who actually are very skeptical about most of the leaders they see today. And that's a good thing. I think they're ready to sort of take control, and the talent is there. I mean, look at how innovative our society is. We have all these problems, but look at all that we're creating on any given day. Look how fast we made vaccines, right? The innovative talent is there. So much of it. The students today are more talented than when I was a student. I often tell my wife, I'll say, you know, my students today, I don't know if I could have gotten into college with them, right? My wife and I went to Stanford, and she'd say, my wife says, "No, no, you couldn't get in. I would get in, but they're so talented." And so if we can train and give power to talented people with integrity, our democracy will be fine. If we don't, if somehow this is a problem, right? If the old people hold on too long, or the wrong people, because not everyone is talented, right? The wrong people get power, then we can be in trouble. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think the talent is there. And again, the world of podcasts to me is this. I mean, so many of my students are listening to podcasts not because they want to, more pornography. They're listening to podcasts because they want to learn, they want to be better. Sometimes it's not even politics. My students who are into athletics and fitness, they listen to fitness podcasts. They learn about their body, and so I see a lot of good attributes and talent in a young generation, and I see that in other societies too. I think in Croatia and others, you're filled with young, talented people.
Wonderful. So, Professor Suri, I would like to thank you for your time and for this wonderful conversation.
My pleasure. Those were fantastic questions. Thank you.